I'll be talking about view transitions, and this is a project that we've been working on for a couple of years. It used to be called shared element transitions. We renamed it because it seems to better represent what we're transitioning. It's like a view of a particular DOM into a view of a different DOM. So the overview here is I'll just give a really quick introduction of how to use this API. For a more comprehensive talk, you should check out Jake's shared element transition talk at Google I/O, and there's a link there. Most of this talk is going to be just the implementation model of like how do we actually do the shared element transition and how does the thing work, and I'll just wrap up with a couple of demos. All right, so right now the majority of navigations, like we all know what that feels like, right? And so you have a particular page that you're looking at. You click something on it. In MPA cases, you potentially wait a little bit, and then the content just disappears from the view, and the new content appears. So the question is, like, what if we wanted even a subtle crossfade, which is, as the demo here has a little crossfade that happens when you click a link. Like, what would it take to actually do that? And in case it's hard to see, there's also a slowed down version of that crossfade here. So for MPA cases, that's not currently possible because we just don't allow you to mix pixels from two different pages. There's no way to do that. And for single page apps, it's obviously possible because you're controlling the whole document, but it's actually kind of hard, especially if it's an existing API and you just want to add a crossfade. You got to keep both versions alive while the fade is happening, and that's can get a little awkward. So this code here is just like an example of what an SBA page might look like. So you'll have some function that changes content. You have a click handler that invokes that function, and you add it, to a listener. This isn't using the view transitions API. This is just a typical SBA skeleton. And by the way, the note there says like this API works well with the navigation API, but I'm not going to be talking about that. That's outside of the scope. So to use the view transitions, you rename your click handler to a deprecated click handler, and you create an experimental click handler. And the only change here is instead of calling change content, you pass that change content function as a callback into start view transition. And this is enough to accomplish this crossfade. So I'll just go over what happens in the background. So when you call this, we create a pseudo DOM structure that kind of looks like this. It's a tree, and it has 5, 6 pseudo elements that serve different roles. So kind of starting from the deepest point, the view transition old and view transition new represent the snapshots of the old page, which is just a pixel snapshot, and a live snapshot of the new content. And by live, I mean if the DOM is updated, this snapshot will also be updated to reflect that. That's contained by a view transition image pair, which creates an isolation isolation node, so that we can blend the replaced elements there. And that pair is contained within a transition group, and the transition group is responsible for figuring out the sizing and the position of the pseudo element. We also create some default animations for this. The cool thing is that all of this is targetable in CSS. So, for example, this load down version of the fade that I showed you is just using the CSS. We just say, make the crossfade, be 5 seconds as opposed to whatever the default is, and the default is 1/4 of a second. So I don't have code here, but to move on, you can also obviously make something like a slide to the side, and this is just using regular CSS animations that's targeting these pseudo elements. But the thing to note here is when the slide is happening, this HTTP 203 header is also sliding, which is kind of a weird experience. So to fix that, we've added a CSS property called a view transition name. The idea here is that you tag your elements with a view transition name, and that makes them a separate captured block, so that can be animated separately from the rest of the capture. So in this case, I give the header and the header text different view transition names, which makes them animate separately from the rest of the content. So here, the root would be still sliding, but the header stays in place because it's separate. And HTTP 203 just moves positions because the old view and the new view have a different position for there. So these are just, the slide is not the default animation, but the header and the text moving are the default animations for this example. As for the pseudo DOM structure, for each view transition name, we create this group basically with all its constituents, and they're all flattened, so there's no hierarchical relationship. So you can kind of move them completely independently. That's it for the introduction, but now I'm going to go over how all of this works. So here I have the render process, which is split into the main thread and the compositor thread. And I have the viz process, which is the GPU process in Chrome. This all starts with the start view transition call. And this just sets up some initial state. It returns the view transition object back to script. And it schedules an animation frame where the rest of the work will continue. Now, I'm kind of going to squish things because I need a lot of space. But when the animation frame happens, we run our typical life cycle, and this is the stuff where we do style and layout and pre-paint and content visibility and resize observers. And after the resize observer steps, we inject view transition steps. So at this point, what we have to do is find all of the elements that were named with the view transition name. We assign them some IDs that we'll use later. We have to make sure to composite these elements because we want to capture the contents of those elements independently. And we queue up a couple of requests. We queue up a capture request that will propagate to the viz process, and we pause rendering on the main thread. So rendering's paused. We do a commit of this frame to the compositor thread. The compositor thread just does what the compositor thread usually does, is rasterization, activation, things like that. And because the elements were composited, it produces render passes for those elements that have the IDs that we generated earlier embedded into them. And we forward that capture request to the viz process. We also pause rendering on the compositor thread. On the viz process, we again just do whatever regular GPU things do. We create copy output requests for all of the render passes that were tagged with IDs. And we store them right in the GPU process. And this is basically keyed by the ID and the renderer that requested this. We send an ACK back to the main thread. It's important to note that this ACK doesn't actually carry any pixel information. This is just saying, yes, we've done the work that you've asked us to do. And the reason for that is that the pixel values of the captured content is never available to the renderer. It's always stored on the GPU. This is, at this point, we run the developer callback that was given to start view transition to update the DOM because we have the texture copy of the old DOM, so we don't need that anymore. After that finishes, we resolve a DOM updated callback to let the developer know that the state has changed. Then immediately after that, we run another set of view transition steps. So it does a very similar thing, but now that the DOM is updated to the new state, we still have to discover all the named elements. We have to do the compositing and all of that. We also, at this point, create the pseudo DOM structure that I was talking about. And we queue up, again, a couple of requests. One is an animate one that propagates to the this process, and we can resume rendering at this point. After we do this, we resolve a ready promise, which can be used to synchronize any kind of developer animations with the view transition. So once we resume rendering, kind of the animation frame happens at its regular cadence. And in there, for the view transition steps, we have to update the geometry of the elements that are participating in this transition, because the DOM could have, like, the script could have changed their location, and we want to make sure that our pseudo elements reflect the fact that the final destination has changed, so the animation is retargeted. And we also update the style sheet as a result of that. At the compositor step, for these pseudo elements, we produce a new type of a quad called the view transition element quad. The asterisk is there because it might not be named that in the code right now, but that's what it's meant to be called. And these reference the IDs that we've been generating at the discovery time, basically. And either at the old DOM or the new DOM, they just embed the ID. So when we get to Viz, we find these quads that are new quads, and what we do is we basically say, if that ID exists in our texture store, we'll just replace the quad with a texture draw quad for that texture. And if the texture is not there, then that means the frame that submitted this quad must have a render pass that is tagged with this, and that's the new content. And so we replace it with a render pass draw quad in that case. And that's it. And so visually you see the content that is meant to be somewhere else is displayed in this pseudo element as a result. And kind of the process continues. Same thing happens for the duration of the animation until ultimately we say, okay, there's no more animation on any of the view transition pseudo elements, and that signals the end of the view transition for us. We queue up a release request, we destroy the pseudo DOM, and we resolve the finish promise. And this release request just propagates Viz and destroys the texture store. So that's kind of the final step of the cleanup. And then that's it. The page just continues as it was before. Whew, that was the model. So now I'm just going to show you a couple of videos of demos. So you've seen this one at the keynote. I think it's cool, but this is basically just tagging elements and creating some simple CSS animations that use the previous and the new states. And then by coincidence, the same person created a different one that shows how you do it with like a bit of network delay. And the way they solve it is basically load a skeleton and then populate the content later. And that's basically all I had. This is our roadmap here. So the single page app support is getting very, very close. There's a spec draft. It's available behind the flag right now. Multi-page app support is also being prototyped, and Addy showed the demo at the keynote. So it's also available behind the flag there. We want to, for 2023, we want to work on a few things. One of them I wanted to highlight is scope transitions, because right now there can only be one transition on the page, and it kind of it essentially acquires a lock on the whole page for the purposes of this transition. So you can't create two transitions at the same time. And scope transitions is an effort to say maybe we can host these pseudo elements on any arbitrary element in the page, and that way you can have a widget that has a transition, and then you can have another widget that's also having a separate transition, and that they don't interfere with each other in any way. And so you can kind of compose it better. And yeah, there's some other enhancements to the model that we may work on, but talk about it if anyone asks. And that's it. Questions? Comments?
Got one in the room.
So when you generate a copy request for the old DOM, how does that interact with the frame tree? So does the copy request always apply to the entire document, or if it comes from like an iframe, do you only copy the iframe?
So you created for each render pass that was tagged with a view transition name. The only reason, by the way, the root is captured is that in the default CSS, we added a view transition name : root for the HTML element. But you can unset that, and then the root wouldn't be captured. And that's why we like composite everything throughout to make sure there's an independent render pass for all of these.
Okay, Flecker.
I've seen sites like Netflix do this thing where you expand a live playback of the thing that you're hovering over into the details view. But I think that would require like a non-static image. Is there support for that kind of use case in the future?
The problem with taking a like if it's the old page, right, the element could already be gone from the page, like we destroyed it. So there's no notion of like keeping it up to date with anything. That's why we use the static snapshot for the old content. There is a way of saying like if it's the same video element, for instance, you can skip the crossfade transition and just display the new content always, and because all you're looking for is the size animation, right? Like you want it to go from little to big, but you could use the new content throughout. You don't need the crossfade there, potentially.
Possibly, like the layout might be different in a way that if you immediately show the new content would result in a sudden flash of content.
That's fair, yeah. Typically, in the cases that I've seen, the crossfade is quick enough that, especially coupled with the size animation, that it's very hard to notice that content was frozen on the previous page. Obviously, you can like slow it down, but I mean, in the real examples, it's usually looks fine to my eye, at least.
Okay, we've got another in person.
Hi, Vlad. Your slides showed the transition animation as a series of mainframes. Do they have to be mainframes, or can it be compositor driven? And then follow-up question. What do you do with input event targeting? And like, for example, hover styles. Would a hover style timer start? When does it start? And how do you do hit testing?
Okay, so the first question, does it have to be mainframes? It's just doing regular CSS animation, so wherever that runs is where it runs. That being said, we are doing a width and height animation, which currently runs on the main thread, and so we're keeping track of the metrics to see if that's a problem and figure out a way to maybe composite that in the future. It's one of the enhancements that we might do in the future. The transform animation, the one that does the positioning, is already running on the compositor, so that will continue to run on the compositor. And your second question was about event targeting. So there's a few pieces here, right? So there's the underlying element that we're representing in a pseudo element. So that element doesn't receive any hit test events. It's as if it was pointer events none, because visually the user would not be seeing anything there. The pseudo element that is being represented, it receives an event as a pseudo element. So it would basically fire on the originating element, which is HTML. we don't do any kind of remapping of the event into the paint of that element to dispatch it to the underlying element, just because there's a bit of weirdness in continuity. But like if you move your mouse across, all of a sudden your X and Y coordinates have to jump because you're representing it somewhere else, right? We are considering adding like a helper function to the API that just says, it takes an event and returns a new event that basically says, please remap this into where is this being hit in the underlying DOM. And then the developer can still listen on the originating element, get these events, and then remap them and dispatch them to their buttons or whatever they need to do. She's got another one.
Are you prepared to talk about multi-page apps and in particular site isolation and how this works?
No.
Thank you.
We're still like very early in the prototype stage, so there's a lot of open questions that we might have not discussed in as much detail as we would like to.
We'll take Chris and then close us out.
Can I give you a softball question?
Yes, please.
What is the most exciting thing you'd like to see out of this in the next few years?
I think just having an immersive experience on your site, and having like an MPA site that feels like a native app where you just naturally transition from site to site. I'm very cautious about, like, I don't want star wipes everywhere because like I know the demos have the same effect. It's like a thumbnail that grows, and I don't really want the thumbnail that grows everywhere now. But I want something, I want the developers to have the tools to be able to express what they want, whether it's, things growing or something else. So I'm just excited to see what developers will create. And thank you, everyone. I think that was it, although Kushal should say something. Kushal has been working on this too.
I was just going to say I can volunteer to answer any questions about multi-page app support.